today we're going to continue on with Chapter 7. And as a reminder, we've been talking about the peripheral nervous system. So one thing to note about the peripheral nervous system is it consists of cranial and spinal nerves. And that's what we've been spending the last couple of lessons learning about. But we're going to kind of go off of there. Once they make the cranial and spinal nerves, how do they get from those nerves all the way to the limbs or organs that they are trying to stimulate? Well, one thing to please note is that the PNS is divided into two systems, and you've heard these words before, and we use them a lot. Sensory division, also known as your afferent division, are going to send impulses to your central nervous system, while motor or your efferent division sends impulses away from your central nervous system. So again, sensory means to, motor means away. However, what we have not focused much on is our motor division. So once we divide to sensory and motor, motor can be further divided into your somatic and your autonomic. Your somatic nervous system, this is things that are going to be under voluntary control. So you being able to move your legs, kick, stand up, you can tell yourself to pick up a pencil. Autonomic, on the other hand, which is abbreviated ANS, this is going to control our body automatically, and sometimes it's called our involuntary nervous system. So these are things that we don't necessarily have to think of in order to do. For example, if we hold our breath, our body's going to automatically make us breathe. Or if we exercise, our heart rate is automatically going to go up. Now, although we are talking about the difference between somatic and autonomic, later on in this lesson, we're going to focus specifically on branches of our autonomic nervous system. And that's because even though all body systems contribute to homeostasis, which is your ability to maintain a certain range, is largely dependent on your autonomic nervous system. So that means every moment your body and brain and spinal cord is constantly sending signals throughout. You're feeling if things are hot, cold, you're telling if you're hungry, if you are low on a hormone. And your central nervous system is processing all of these signals. And oftentimes, your ANS is the one that needs to make adjustments in order to support daily functions and daily activities that take place in your body. For example, it allows your blood to be shunted or basically moved to areas that are more needed. A good example of this is when you are cold or if you're working out. You want your blood flow to go to your main organs, such as your heart, your muscles, and going to your lungs, because that's the area of your body that's going to need those glucose molecules carried by blood. Another thing, if you're hot, blood flow actually is able to go to the surface of your skin in order to release that heat located in your blood. Other things that I can control is heart and breathing rate can cause it to speed up or slow down. Blood pressure can be adjusted, and even things like stomach secretions. You don't have to think about it. When you eat food, your body automatically releases enzymes in order to break down the food that you've eaten. So now that we kind of hit on somatic is going to be your voluntary, autonomic is going to be your involuntary. These two systems differ in other ways besides that. One of the ways is the effector organs that they are going to stimulate. The second thing is the neurotransmitters they release. And the last one is going to be your motor pathway. So how does the signal get to where it needs to go? If we're talking about effector organs, our somatic is going to stimulate our skeletal muscles because these are the muscles that we have control over. We're able to kick a ball. We're able to flex our biceps. The autonomic, on the other hand, this is going to stimulate things like your cardiac muscle that involves your heartbeat, smooth muscle like your stomach moving in order to digest food, and even glands that release hormones. If we're talking in terms of neurotransmitters, the somatic is going to release acetylcholine, which is what we learned about in chapter 5 when we learned about the muscular system. Acetylcholine was our neurotransmitter that went across a synaptic cleft. And then our autonomic, this actually has other neurotransmitters besides acetylcholine, and it includes norepinephrine and epinephrine. The last one is our motor pathways. Before we go on and talk about our motor pathways, I just kind of want to go over an image real quick to describe it to you. Here is our major divisions. Our first one is our somatic, and our second one is autonomic. Now, autonomic can be further divided, but we're just going to focus on this one up here, the top one, because it's closest. Our somatic, notice that the effector organ is always skeletal, and our neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. Whereas if we're looking at our autonomic, here we have two different neurotransmitters that are available, and my effector organs are also different: smooth, glands, and cardiac. From there, we can talk about the motor pathways. One major difference between the picture we saw on the last page was how many neurons were there. So if we look back here, somatic shows one single neuron. Here's my cell body, and it's extending all the way to whatever it wants to stimulate. Whereas in our autonomic, I have a cell body, I have one neuron. It goes to a second neuron, and then that can go to whatever it would like to stimulate. So the major difference is the number of neurons that are available. So if we go back, somatic is going to be our one that has one motor neuron. It originates in our central nervous system and then extends to the skeletal muscles that they serve. Autonomic nervous system, this is going to be two motor neurons. And these motor neurons get the abbreviation to tell you which one's which. Our preganglionic neuron, pre means before, is the one that's going to be in the brain or spinal cord. It then comes out of your brain or spinal cord and synapses or connects to a second neuron called the postganglionic neuron. Post meaning like after. This is the one that's going to extend to whatever organ you're trying to stimulate. So think of like a pre and post test. Pre is before, post is the second one. If you look at this picture, here is going to be your preganglionic axon or your preganglionic neuron. Here is synapses into your second one. Now, hopefully you understood some of the differences between autonomic and somatic. If you struggled with any of that, please make sure that you're reaching out to me and we can go through it a little bit slower. But without further ado, we are going to continue on with specifically talking about our ANS. And the reason we have to talk about our ANS is because there are two subdivisions. It can be further divided into your sympathetic and your parasympathetic systems. Now, what's cool about these systems is they actually serve the same organ, but they have opposite effects on the organ. So they're said to be antagonistic of one another. For example, in your sympathetic nervous system, this is going to mobilize your body during extreme situations, such as you're afraid, maybe you're exercising, or you're mad. So this is going to get you up, moving, and ready to go. Parasympathetic, though, this is what allows you to unwind and kind of relax. You're not afraid, you're chilling on the couch, and you're happy. We're going to specifically hit on the anatomy of these two divisions, and then tomorrow we're going to have a lesson based on the physiology. So if we're going to talk about the anatomy, this gets a little complicated. So again, if you do not understand any part, you have access to your textbook and you always have access to me. Make sure you ask. For our anatomy of our parasympathetic division, one thing to know is its name. It can sometimes be called your craniosacral division because of where the preganglionic neurons come from or originate from. There are two major regions where parasympathetic neurons come from. The first one is they branch off cranial nerves. Specifically, they branch off from cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. The other way that it branches off is based off your spinal cord or your spinal nerves. and this occurs in your sacral region. So S meaning sacral. That's why we get the name cranial sacral. If I bring up this picture, notice that if I'm looking at my parasympathetic over here, here I have my branches off of my brain. So here I see all of my branches in my cervical, and they can affect my eye, salivary glands, heart, lungs, stomach, all the way down to my bladder. Then there are no more branches for your parasympathetic all the way until you get down here in your sacral region. And this is going to affect your bladder and your genitals. So let's talk about those two regions since that's what it's named after. Your cranial region is going to send out their axons out of the cranial nerves to serve your head and neck region. Hence, cranial, it's going to serve your head, and your neck is right next to it. In the head and neck, preganglionic neurons basically synapse to a motor neuron to something known as the terminal ganglia. Ganglion is just a cluster of cell bodies. These are going to then extend to whatever organs that you're trying to stimulate. Your sacral region, on the other hand, your preganglionic axons leave your spinal cord. And what's special about these is they actually fuse to become part of your pelvic splanchnic nerves. These are also called your pelvic nerves because they travel and serve organs that are in your pelvic cavity. So if we look back at our sacral region, here is our sacral region. Notice that it stimulates and works with your bladder and your genitals, which are all protected and located in your pelvis. So inside the pelvic cavity, this is where we meet our postganglionic neuron, and they go to wherever they need to go. Your sympathetic division, on the other hand, is called your thoracolumbar division because they originate in your T1, so T is going to be your thoracic, all the way to your L2, L meaning lumbar, hence thoracolumbar. Now what happens here is axons tend to leave the spinal cord through something called the ventral root that we learned about when we went over the spinal cord. They enter into our spinal nerve. They then divide and go to the ramus, pass through a short little connection called your ramus communicans, where they enter into a sympathetic trunk ganglion. And this lies really, really close to the spinal cord. Please note that this ganglion is just a cluster of cell bodies. If we look at this picture, I'm going to kind of draw the route for you that it will take. Here is our spinal cord, so it's going to go out the ventral root, and I have to say ventral is the front. So here it's going out the ventral root. It's going to come, and this fused part right here, behind that line is our spinal nerve, so it's going to come out your spinal nerve. Here, this part is considered our ramus. So it comes out through our ramus, through our ramus communicans. So here they actually have that white part labeled ramus communicans, which again is just right here, until it gets in here to your sympathetic trunk ganglion. Once it gets in here, it can decide to do two different things. So there are two pathways it can take. The first pathway is if it decides to synapse to your postganglionic neuron in your ganglion. The other, if it decides to pass right through and does not synapse. So one synapses and the other doesn't. If it does synapse at the ganglion, the axon then goes to your second neuron at the same or different level and then just re-enters the spinal nerve to travel to the skin. If it does not synapse, what it does is it keeps going and forms something known as your splanchnic nerves. And instead of synapsing at the sympathetic ganglion, it goes to something called the collateral ganglion. This is where it decides to synapse, and it serves your abdominal and your pelvic organs. I love this picture because it shows so many things in one. What it shows, and what I'm going to kind of point out, is what happens when it does synapse in our ganglion. So if we follow this, here, they're all going to go out the ventral root, come into our spinal nerve. They're going to go out to our ramus, pass through our ramus communicans. From here, if it decides to synapse, it can synapse at the same level. So here, where I'm circling, is a synapse at the same level. Or it can synapse at a different level. So here is a synapse at a higher level. Once it synapses, it goes through back to your spinal cord or spinal nerve and then goes to wherever it's trying to serve. On the other hand, if it does not synapse, it's going to follow that same path, go through the ventral root, spinal cord, ramus communicans. But here, when it gets into your sympathetic trunk, it doesn't synapse. What it does instead is it keeps going, and it forms our splanchnic nerve, all the way till it gets to your collateral ganglion, which go to things like your small intestine. So here, this is just bringing up your sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Note that para takes place in your cervical or your cranial region and your sacral. Sympathetic, this is going to hit a lot of your organs, and they get signals from your thoracic and your lumbar. And that's the end of today's lesson. Let me know if you guys have any questions, and I'll be more than happy to help.